Good evening. Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time.
Will you raise your right hand, Mr. President, and repeat after me? I, George Walker Bush.
I, George Walker Bush.
Do solemnly swear.
Do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office of President of the United States.
The office of President of the United States.
And will to the best of my ability.
And will to the best of my ability.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
Preserve, protect, and defend.
The Constitution of the United States.
The Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations.
Not under man, but under God and law. That's the ruling principle of American freedom, the source of our democratic liberties. I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country.
So, you know, you've got this controversial election, and we've had them before, but never before had the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in, and a lot of folks believe that the court chose the president.
Usually the president will come in and claim a mandate. Very difficult for George Bush to do. And into his first term, there were consistently about 40% or so of Americans who did not accept his presidency as legitimate. And indeed, his first 9 months in office were very difficult. And already by the fall of 2001, there was talk about the failed presidency. Usually you're given a year or so before they come out with that sort of language. Then 9/11 hit. And President Bush embraced 9/11 as the defining issue of this era and of his presidency.
If you look at Bush's popularity ratings on September 11th or September 10th of 2001, they weren't anything special. They were just sort of showing that he was doing a mediocre job for those first 8.5 months. And so you get this September 11th effect where you see within a week, even probably less than a week, after September 11th, his ratings skyrocket to almost 90%. He stands on the rubble, you know, within a day or so after the incident happens, and we have this rally around the flag effect, although it was really a rally around the president effect. The question that history will ask is whether he put those high approval ratings and all the power that he had to good use.
This legislation is essential not only to pursuing and punishing terrorists, but also preventing more atrocities in the hands of the evil ones.
Essentially, after 9/11, the country had to come to terms with the threat to our national security. And in that trade-off, national security steps were going to have to be taken in terms of conducting warrantless domestic spying, the confinement of enemy combatants, and other sorts of steps that were quite extraordinary, and that the protections for individual civil liberties, which are at the core of our Bill of Rights, our constitutional system, and the values of America, all those things are going to have to be sacrificed given this new era of national security threats.
There have been a total of over 480 people arrested or detained. 614 persons. Detained nearly 1,000 individuals.
I wouldn't use the word abuse. I don't think that there was any abuse of power. No one would say that. I think that Congress believed, the President believed, the American people believed, everybody believed that the U.S. had to do something to protect itself. Executive power inherently increases because we need to protect ourselves. So I don't think it was an abuse of power in any way. I think that it may have been an overzealous use of power. But that's not just on the president. That was on members of Congress as well. Now, did they act rashly? I think that the answer to that is probably yes. You've got this law that is several thousand pages long, that many members of Congress admitted that they hadn't even read, that they went and voted. They just knew that we needed to give more power to the president. Now, that's not unusual. We know throughout the entire history of the United States, from the Civil War to World War II, I guess those are the two best examples, but in other times of crisis as well, the president's always increased power. Executive power inherently increases because we need to protect ourselves. I think that there will be a lot of history written in the end about the harm that the administration maybe did to civil liberties through the Patriot Act. Well, now, to the constitutionality of the Patriot Act. It's debatable. I think that a case can be made that a lot of the provisions, given that they were written in haste, are constitutionally questionable, and it won't be for years and years from now that we'll know for certain when higher courts, U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals, and then ultimately maybe the U.S. Supreme Court begin to review those provisions when people believe that their rights have been violated by the Act. But I think that there are a lot of provisions that people think are questionable. The whole idea of being able to wiretap phones, and it is not specific to terrorists. It's if we suspect you of any sort of crime. If you read the Act broadly, we could wiretap your phone, even if we don't know for sure, and you never have to know about it. To being able to get lists of what you've checked out from the local library, if they suspect that maybe you are acting like a terrorist.
One of the biggest legacies of George Bush will be in the judiciary. And he came in, he described himself as a compassionate conservative, and the judges that were put up for the Supreme Court and for the appellate courts are anything but conservative. These are actually judges who are quite active, but in a direction that tilts to the right.
A lot of folks think that President Bush is putting people on the bench because of their views on abortion. Right, that's what we like to hear in the news, right? We see this debate about pro-life versus pro-choice. But your question is very appropriate, because what the administration cared about more was executive power. So there will be lasting influence. That said, the final word is still the U.S. Supreme Court, because you have a U.S. Supreme Court that is incredibly in favor of executive power. So from Chief Justice Roberts to Justices Alito, Thomas, Scalia, and to some extent Kennedy are very strong proponents of executive power.
The Bush administration and its judges have really downgraded the Constitution, the Supreme Court, and the judicial process.
The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands. So it is the policy of the United States to seek and support the growth of democratic movements and institutions in every nation and culture, with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world. All who live in tyranny and hopelessness can know the United States will not ignore your oppression or excuse your oppressors. Renewed in our strength, tested but not weary, we are ready for the greatest achievements in the history of freedom.
You know, the Bush second inaugural lays out a ringing endorsement of some of the most important American principles of freedom, self-determination, and democracy, of checks against tyranny, and the oppression of the individual. These are some of the core principled foundations of the American system of governance and our notion of liberty and freedom. And yet when you look in the Middle East, it's very hard to find much evidence of that. George Bush is leaving office with the vision of the second inaugural largely empty. And some would argue the direction has been backwards. And maybe the best example of the vision in the second inaugural is Iraq, which may be different things, but it's not a flowering democracy. And indeed, the president has largely walked away from that vision himself and is talking more about kind of a coalition government in which there's a kind of a balance of power. And indeed, that has been the military approach in the last few years of empowering the Sunnis, these so-called awakening groups, to counterbalance the government Shia militia then you've got the Kurds in the north. So this is a very different notion of kind of an open democratic society. It's really more of a kind of armed warring factions that check each other, both in the streets and occasionally through the parliamentary process. In some ways, I think the Bush presidency will go down not only as a failed presidency, because of what has happened abroad in terms of foreign policy and now the financial crisis. All of that is going to be put at his, his feet. He'll be held responsible for it. But also as a missed presidency, as really a presidency that set out with big goals and did not achieve them. On the other hand, there may well be some accounts that credit President Bush for having a steadfast position in the face of overwhelming public opposition. And this is sometimes known as the kind of the Truman principle.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in the first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
I would be surprised if there's, much of a tilt toward reevaluating George Bush as a kind of Harry Truman type leader. My hunch is that while there will be some, nod in that direction, and maybe a book or so, that most historians are going to view the Bush presidency as one of the weakest, most disappointing and damaging in American history.